Hi, I'm International Grandmaster Ron W. Henley, and welcome to OnlineChessLessons.net 5th round coverage of the World Chess Olympiad being played in Istanbul. Today's feature match on board 1 comes from Russian Federation playing Armenia. A couple of the big favorites fighting it out for first place, and on board 1, Vladimir Kramnik, 2797, against Lev Aronian, 2816. So you have two world-class players going at it on board 1. Let's take a look. d4, d5, c4, c6. The Slav defense has become one of the real workhorses among world-class grandmasters over the last 10 to 15 years. Very solid, very tough to get an advantage. So after knight c3, knight f6, and now Kramnik plays an interesting approach here. Instead of the more normal knight to f3, Kramnik goes ahead and plays the exchange on d5 with c takes d5, c takes d5, and then bishop to f4. Now this does allow for very rapid development of the white queenside. Knight c6, e3, and now, quite often, if black solves the problem of this bishop by playing out to f5, then white will counter to try and get a little pull in the position by playing bishop to b5, pinning this knight. Therefore, black plays a6, keeping the white knight and bishop off of the b5 square. After bishop d3, g6. Well, the idea here for black is fianchetto the bishop, and also to offer the exchange of the light-squared bishop with bishop to f5. e6 has been played, but the problem is, of course, it locks in this bishop, and it's a long time before this bishop on c8, known as the problem child for black, finds a way out. Now, the drawback to g6 is that once he does fianchetto this bishop, it's hard for black to make progress in the center, and it doesn't really have much influence on the queen side. So in fact, after g6, black has only scored a kind of miserable 35%. So I would say g6 is probably a bit dubious and probably the beginning of black's problems in this game. The recommended way to play here is probably bishop g4. This way you get your bishop outside the pawn chain, you're ready to follow up with e6, bishop e7, get castled, and in fact, black has had very good results with this. Grandmasters Bakro, Gelfand, Malikov, and Kazhmedinov, pretty good resume, have all done very well with black. So I would say bishop g4 probably is the way to go here. Instead, after g6, well, Kramnik keeps the pieces off of g4, and then after bishop f5, doesn't worry about it, just develops. Black, of course, is happy to exchange these light-squared bishops, but note, white does have a slight lead in development. After bishop g7, castles, castles, and now, what looks like it might be a new move by Kramnik. He plays rook at f to c1. And we can see now all of the white pieces have prospects on the queen side. This knight can swing to d2, the b and a pawns can go forward, and the two rooks are all over there. So white definitely has a little bit of an edge and force on the queen side. In previous games, rook at a to c1, but of course, what's the game plan for this rook? And a3. Both of these have been played with pretty unimpressive results for white. So rook at f to c1 looks logical, but looks like it might also be a little bit of a new move here. Black plays e6, and now white could continue with rook at a to b1, getting ready to thrust forward with b4 and get the queenside operations underway. Instead, he played knight a4, getting ready to occupy the square on c5. After knight e4, bopped on into c5, knight takes gets rid of the knight, however, it gives white a step up on doubling rooks along the c-file. After queen d7, rook at a to c, and we can see it's all systems go on the c-file for white. Note the knight can't move from c6 without penetration to c7 by the black rooks. Rook at f to c8, of course, trying to neutralize the c-file action, and now the quiet a3. Takes away the b4 square, from the black knight, threatens the possibility of the launch pawn to b4 himself, gaining space on the queen side. Bishop to f8, and we see this bishop didn't really have anything useful to do, and now chases the rook. Rook back to c2, and f6 to cover the e5 square. Of course, after bishop d6, looking to trade bishops right away, white could just simply play takes, takes, and then knight e5, exploiting the pin. And here, a move like rook c7, takes, takes. And this is the kind of position that white hopes for. 2 pawn weaknesses to attack versus his 1 weak pawn on b2. Player like Kramnik or Anand, they would love technical positions like this. And then queen up. And you can see it's a bit unpleasant for black. So in the game, after f6, now Kramnik swings his knight over. And note the knight is really the only piece that's not participating in the queenside action. Black plays bishop d2. A logical question is what happens if black expands in the center with e5. After de, fe, white has choices. He could play bishop g5, and then, for example, queen e6, e4, chipping away at the white center and trying to get him forced to block on light squares. Or he could also play the tricky knight e4. Either way, white has a slight edge, but nothing overwhelming. In the game, after bishop d6, the exchange, and now knight to b3, and we see the second knight threatens to come into c5, or possibly to a5. Black played rook c7. In retrospect, might have been better to play b6. As we've mentioned a few times from Karpov, the pawn on knight 3 guards the squares and kind of kills the prospects for this knight. White could try to get a little initiative with e4, and now black probably should hunker back with queen d7. Note that de4, queen e4, knight e7 does not solve black's problems because after takes, 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 and queen a8, little penetration, white wins a pawn. So in the game though, after knight b3, black prepares to meet the pressure down the c-file. Plays rook c7, but now Kramnik strikes from the other side with a knight a5, thanks to the pin on the c-file. Rook at a to c8, and it seems that black has managed to defend everything. However, Kramnik now uncorks beautiful knight sacrifice, knight takes b7, and this absolutely shatters the black queen side. After rook takes, queen takes on a6, we can see the knight on c6 is attacked 3 times, and cross-pinned, pinned to the rook on c8, and pinned laterally to the queen on d6. And the rook on b7 is attacked as well. After rook to c7, simply b4. Remember, we mentioned that this knight was cross-pinned, which means it's also pinned to the queen here. So the threat is simply b5, followed by taking the pinned knight. Queen d7 unpins the knight, and now, very nice quiet move. Queen to c7. Queen to b6, keeping an eye on the black rook on c7, and thus keeping the knight on c5 under control. In the game, black plays queen e8, pretty much abandoning trying to protect all of his pieces on c7 and c6. However, let's take a look. Suppose he tried to attack the queen. Well then, the shot, rook takes c6. Rook takes b6, and then rook check, and rook c7 recoups the queen, leaving white a solid 2 pawns ahead. Let's go back. Suppose he tried to attack the queen with the other rook. Well, similar type story, but a little more complicated. Again, the queen sacrifice, knight takes, and then rook takes c7. And we can see black's problems are the lack of coordination among his pieces and his boxed-in king and white's control of the 7th rank. After queen takes, queen to b5, rook up, queen back, and now, nice move, rook e7. Threatens simply rook c8, leading to mate on the back rank. For example, king f8, doubling rooks on the 7th, knight c6. Now, of course, you could play rook takes h7. Again, very powerful threat of mate. If the king slides over to avoid that, you check him, force him away, and then rook b7. This would allow you to recoup the queen because you obviously threaten rook h8 mate, as well as rook takes on b6. Very, very nice calculation because, of course, Kramnik had to see a lot of this before he sacrificed the piece on b7 on move 23. In the game, Aronian played queen e8, but then the simple b5. Here, Aronian tried to make the best of the situation and went in for the complications with knight takes d4. White, of course, collected the rook on c7, but now the trick, knight e2 check. King h1 and knight c1, and black's recouped the rook. And in fact, white only has one pawn for the piece here. However, note that this knight is very far away. As the Russians say, the knight hops on short legs. Rook c8, queen c8, and now queen c6. Exclamation point. Attacking the queen, attacking the pawn, and here's what we say when we say the knight hops on short legs, because of course, in the game he plays queen d8. But we can readily see, had he exchanged queens, this knight would be way too far away and have no chance of catching this pawn. This pawn would just be going straight up, and that would be the end of the game. So after the very nice shot queen c6, we can see white will at least recoup his knight. He plays queen d8, and now Kramnik doesn't bother with this pawn or this knight. Instead, simply b6. Of course, queen takes c1 was winning with 2 extra outside passed pawns, but b6 is even stronger. This pawn increases in value as it moves up the board, and right now it's 2 squares away from being worth 9.5 points. After king up, again, queen c7 check. Attacking the queen, the king, and of course the knight is still on the menu if you need it. King e8, again, queen takes. Wait, king e8, and now the very nice touch, queen a7. Had he played queen c1, queen b6, well, you know, white's got a little bit better of the queen ending, but still far away from winning. However, queen a7 threatens just simply bam, bam. And we see the knight is on short legs, as the Russian says. It needs 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 4 moves to get back and blockade this pawn, which is threatening to go in 2. Aronian decides to get his own passed pawn, but after b7, resigned. Point being that after b7, d3, he's too late. b8, d2, and then simple mop-up procedure, check, check, trade queens, and queen takes d2, picks up the knight even. So a fantastic, nice, solid positional display, almost effortless display by Vladimir Kramnik, and that drew first blood in this very important match. Earlier today, the US drew 2-2 with Germany, and the battle for first place is on.